All right, guys, moving right along. The Gospel of John contains a variety of ideas that cater to the tastes of both Orthodox and heretical theologians. In favor of the Orthodox Jesus is the Logos made flesh. And Jesus also declares that he never spoke anything in secret in favor of the Gnostics and Marcion. Jesus spoke of a purely spiritual kingdom as opposed to a literal end time fulfillment as described by the other Gospels. Jesus also appeals to a God that the world has not known, which is also consistent with the latter schools. The case can actually be made that John has a dual theology. There is one part of John that echoes the Jewish tradition, and there is another part of John that really resembles some form of Gnosticism. When these ideas are presented side by side, it appears that some ideas contradict other ideas, and this in turn raises the question of the tampering. So let's take a look at some examples. Now, before we go into this, I do want to clarify a couple things so people know that when people start saying Gnosticism and esoteric thought and mysticism, they're all different things. They're not the same. I'm not so sure that Gnosticism is something that we should be using um, as a hardcore defining term. So I believe he's treating it right, kind of leaving it's vague. It's just a school that's usually a mix of esoteric or Gnostic thought, and just means knowledge, gnosis. But I don't want to just don't get too hung up on these terms when you start saying Orthodox and Gnostic. What he means is basically what has become known to be Christianity for the most part versus some other view of Christianity that has its roots in another tradition. That's all it's really getting to. Okay, so we go on. A. Jesus is the Jewish Christ, but also the unbiblical Logos. John tells us that the law came through Moses, but grace came through Jesus Christ, and that no man has seen God at any time. Yet Jesus also says that Moses wrote of him. John 1:17 through 18, 5:39, 45 through 47. The conflict theme raises this question. If only Jesus brings the truth, then how can Moses have any truth? Jesus nowhere says that he appeared to Moses himself. The two passages cited cannot be reconciled. Let us also recall that Jesus never appeals to Moses as a witness when he defends his own divinity before the Pharisees in John 5:31 through 33. Jesus appeals only to his Father in John the Baptist as a witness. In John 5:45 through 47, Jesus accuses the Jews of trusting in Moses instead of himself. Yet Jesus also accused the Jews of not believing in Moses either. The entire passage from John 5:39 through 47 does not make sense. It's possible that the passage has been interpolated, and that originally it said that the Jews looked to Moses and the scriptures instead of accepting Jesus. Verse 39b, 46, and 47 obstruct the logical flow of ideas and were probably added by a Catholic scribe. If these verses are removed, then the passage makes complete logical sense. The Jews look to the scriptures for life rather than Jesus, and the Jews trust Moses rather than Jesus. John 9:29. Jesus says that he is the light of the world, and the world is in darkness without him. Yet Moses is also said to have knowledge of him. John 18:12, 5:39, and 46. Once again, the offending verses in John 5 cited above contradict Jesus' other statements. In John 4:20 through 23, Jesus tells the Samaritan woman that she knows not what she worships, and that we Jews know what we should worship because salvation is of the Jews. Yet at the time of Jesus, yet at that time Jesus also says that the hour is coming, ye shall neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem worship the Father, but the hour cometh when true worshippers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. John 4:24. This is the very same statement Jesus simultaneously affirms and denies that the Jews understand true worship. In other passages, Jesus also accused the Jews of not knowing the Father, and that they would, and that the world has not known the Father. John 8:19, 8:44, 17:25. If verse 22 is removed from chapter 4, then the passage makes complete sense. Jesus reveals to both Jews and Samaritans that God can only be worshipped in spirit and in truth, which in turn is consistent with Jesus' statement about the world has not known the Father. Jesus says that the world has not seen, heard, or known the Father, and presumably Jesus was the Logos sent to reveal him. Yet Jesus also says he must fulfill the law of the Jews, which he calls their law, John 15:25. Note that Jesus doesn't say, I must fulfill God's law. No, it's the law of the Jews, and he must fulfill it. But why? This final enigma is at the core of the insoluble enigma that is the Gospel of John. I call it the problem insoluble out of respect to the credulity of my readers. With that caveat in place, I would proceed and suggest that the theory may solve the problem. What the writer of John may be hinting at is that Jesus represented a reality that Moses and the prophets allude to imperfectly in their writings. The Hebrew writers had all these ideas about what God was like, and when God gave, what kind of laws he gave. But as the letters of Paul and John seems to stop short of affirming that Moses and the prophets knew God in any direct way, Paul says that the law was ordained by angels. In John, Jesus says that Moses came in his own name, 543. Moses did not come in God's name and never saw God, as Jewish tradition maintained, John 1:17 through 18, John 4:12. Jesus was sent by the Father as an act of mercy to reveal himself to the Jews. Jesus identified himself by fulfilling their law, John 15:25. Jesus' mission was to liberate the Jews from their own religious enslavement, as viewed by this Gentile writer who obviously had a prejudice against the Jews of his day. This prejudice, in turn, had a formative influence on the theology of John's Gospel. This writer is out to establish a difference between Jesus' Father and the God worshipped by most Jews. Even the law of Moses is placed outside of John's theological paradigm. In John, Jesus fulfills the law, but he never demands obedience to it. The ones who obey the law are the same ones who are trying to kill Jesus. Hence, Jesus fulfills the law in order to demonstrate the law is inherently unjust. This is why Jesus refers to the law of the Pharisees as their law. In connection with Jesus' mission to fulfill prophecy and liberate the Jews is the idea that the prince of this world is cast out. By dying an unjust death, he condemns the ruler, the archon, John 12:31 through 33 and 19:11. The casting out of the ruler or prince leads to another problem. Who is this ruler and how did he come to power? The Gospel of John does not explain this. Orthodox tradition has its explanation, and Gnostic tradition has its mythology. One possible answer is that the ruler was appointed by God to govern the world, but fell into wickedness in the fragments of Papias. A similar notion can be found among early Christian theologians. To some of the angels he gave dominion over the arrangement of the world, but it happened that their arrangement came to nothing. This passage refers to an early and obscure tradition that was embraced among early Christians in varying forms, and is reflected in some biblical passages. This was the idea that God had bestowed the government of the world onto his angelic sons. In fact, this is what is stated in certain Old Testament passages, such as Deuteronomy 32:8 through 9 and Psalm 82. What then occurred, according to the myth, was that these angels or sons began to fight with one another for domination. The result of this world eventually falls under the authority of one of the angels, who has set himself up as the archon. For John, some such theosophical myth would account for why the world was created through Jesus, the Logos, but does not know him and will not receive him. In John, it may be that the ruler has set himself up falsely as God and has led men astray. Moses mediated a covenant with the ruler. Jesus fulfilled the law in order to demonstrate the law is an enmity between God. Thus is Jesus destined to be slain by the Jews as part of his fulfillment of their law, John 15:25. In this way, Jesus condemns both the archon and the law. He fulfills their law by dying an unjust death, and in the way he condemns the archon who gave the law. Of note is that of John 8:44. The archon is identified as the devil and as the liar and murderer, and from the very beginning. Jesus tells the Jews that this is their father, the devil. I'll stop this one right here.